Good morning, dear collaborators or future collaborators. I have recorded this short video of my presentation to a recent congress about animals in ancient Egypt, which occurred in Naples last week. I thought this would be the occasion to show you some preliminary results of an article I would like to submit by the end of July. I still have to include some specimens in the analysis, but the main results should not change much. Among the many animals buried in Egypt, dogs are amongst the most commonly found. But were they really all dogs? The archaeologists among you may reply that no, of course, I have already found some bone remains of wild canids during my excavations. Some of you may have found remains of foxes, such as red foxes or rupal foxes, Vulpes rebelli, and some may even suggest they found jackals. Anyway, their presence seems rather exceptional in canid mummies. Most of them are aimed to be domestic dogs, and they were likely bred and kept in captivity on purpose. But couldn't it be a bias related to the methodology employed to describe the remains? Let me explain. Currently, remains are determined by comparison with modern domestic dogs, mainly skulls of dogs of average morphology, not modified by the recent human selections, and some wild species likely to be present in ancient Egypt. And these species mostly include Vulpes vulpes, the red fox, the rupal fox, and jackals. I see already two problems. The first problem is what we considered as a jackal in reference samples. So far, we considered golden jackals, that's to say Canis aureus. However, recent studies have found that the jackals present in Africa are from a different species, Canis aureus or Canis lupaster, which is closer to the grey wolves than the golden jackals, which are actually limited to Eurasia. In Egypt, we may find a cryptic subspecies, Canis lupaster. Moreover, as Egypt is at the crossroad with the Near and Middle East, where golden jackals are present, it is not impossible that both golden wolves and golden jackals were present in ancient Egypt. Thus, we should consider in our comparisons specimens of both Canis and Canis aureus. The second problem is that there are many other species which were likely to be found in ancient Egypt. Here are all the canids present in Africa or in the Near East nowadays. We have no way to state that they could be present in ancient Egypt. So, of course, for many of these, the skulls are very different. So you may say that the rupal fox, for example, can't be mistaken with the Cape fox or a fennec. Of course, I agree. But there are some species that look very similar. So, for example, the rupal fox and the pale fox. And the pale fox is never considered in the comparisons analysis. And for canis species, for example, the black-backed jackal, the side-striped jackal are never considered in the analysis, and they look very similar when you see the skulls like this, with the Persian and Arabian grey wolf or the golden wolf. So in foxes, I've included the fennec, which has a very particular profile and is unlikely to be mistaken for a dog, of course. We also have the rupal fox and the pale fox, which is very similar to the rupal fox. Although the grey wolf is absent from Africa, two subspecies are present nowadays in the Near East and the Middle East. And they were thus likely to be present in ancient Egyptian canids, all the more that these animals can travel long distances. There are also many other species of jackal, so the black-backed jackals and the side-striped jackal. We can thus easily imagine that we may have missed some wild specimens in our previous identifications. The proportion of wild canids in catacombs may thus be greater than previously thought, which may change our vision of the practices surrounding canid mummification. Currently, we consider that most of the animals used for mummification were bred on purpose and then sacrificed to be turned into offerings for deities. The difficulty to breed and keep in captivity wild animals make dogs a privileged target for mummification compared to their wild counterparts. But it is possible that things were less clear and that ancient Egyptians collected everything they could, including feral dogs or dead cadavers of wild canids visiting the cemeteries. The polymorphic aspect of Anubis allows all kinds of options. Its straight ears and elongated snout reminds one of a jackal more than of a dog. Given that skulls are often well preserved in ancient Egyptian series, I tried to provide a more complete and accurate method to determine whether isolated skulls belong to a domestic dog or to a wild canid. In the future, we can easily imagine to adapt this method to different fragmentation patterns. Given that the taxonomy is very complex and still not completely understood, and because ancient Egyptians were unlikely to use similar classification as we do, I found it more appropriate to question the domestic versus wild status rather than trying to identify the exact species in ancient mummies. I have considered a reference sample, which I use to build decision rules for predicting the species of archaeological skulls, and then an archaeological sample on which I applied my determination method. The modern reference sample is constituted of 100 crania of domestic dogs and 155 crania of wild canids. For dogs, I considered different breeds to include more or less long-headed dogs, and I also included 25 feral dogs, mostly found in Tunisia. For the wild sample, I considered all the species present nowadays in Africa or in the Near and Middle East. This includes foxes of several species, Persian and Arabian grey wolves, Ethiopian wolf, the lycaon, and several species of jackals. For example, the side-striped jackal and black-backed jackal, golden wolves, of course, jackals from Syria and Persia. I applied my methods to a sample of 41 crania of ancient canid mummies from the Musée des Confluences in Lyon, which holds the world's most significant collection of animal mummies outside Egypt. Most of canid mummies were brought by Louis Lortet and Claude Gaillard or Maspero at the beginning of the 20th century. These mummies are from the late period. We have no precise date for these specimens, but some of the dog mummies from the collection were radiocarbon dated, and the oldest date to the 30th dynasty, around 360 before Christ. Some of the mummies are described in La Faune momifiée de l'Égypte ancienne, where a species identification and a provenance is sometimes proposed based on a qualitative examination. I wanted to propose a method which respects at best the geometry of the skull and which allows an easy collect of data on the field. So first, I reconstructed the crania in 3D using photogrammetry. This is a very cheap and efficiency method to build 3D models, and it can be easily applied on the field as it needs very few specialized equipment, just a good camera. So the method consists in taking pictures all around the skull. A software program tries to align the photos and extract some common points, which are then triangulated to reconstitute the external shape of the object. Once a texture is added, it feels like you have the object in your hands. It's therefore a method of choice to virtually expose the material and to study it later after completion of the mission, which is particularly important in Egypt as you can't get anything from the field and to export it. It's impossible. To describe the shape thoroughly, I used 3D geometric morphometrics. I placed landmarks all over the surface of the skulls. This method allows to describe the geometric aspects of the cranium, contrary to classical linear morphometrics that is used throughout by Egyptologists. It is true that this requires some special skills in statistics, but it allows to go further in the description of shape. I compared the efficiency of the geometric method with the linear method by considering 13 linear measurements classically taken on the skull. When describing the form of an object, two things must be considered: its size and its proportions once the size has been removed. This is called the shape. So I ran analysis to separate the size information from shape informations, and then I performed analysis on the separate size and shape. As you can see here, size is clearly not enough to identify the species, as there is an important overlap between most species example between dogs, grey and golden wolves. It may be enough, however, to identify phenix in both geometric and linear analysis. If we now look at the shape of the cranium in 3D geometric analysis. So I'll take some time to clarify this graph. Here I summarize the morphological variability within the modern sample. Each point represents a specimen characterized by the 3D shape of its skull. The closer to points, the more similar. Of course, with these two axes, we only look at a part of the morphological variability existing in the dataset. You have to imagine that it's variabilities in a space in several dimensions, and we focused on the two main dimensions here. Axis 1 corresponds globally to the length and width of the skull, as you can see here. And axis 2 is related to the width of the neurocranium and muzzle. Let's have a closer look at the distribution of species within the graph. First, we observe that dogs occupy a very important part of the total variability in the modern sample, with feral dogs on the middle. Second, domestic dogs show an overall clear distinction from wild species, which tends to be on the right part of the scatter plot. The different species of foxes are on the top, very far from dogs, so no risk of confusion. For canid species, some are very far from dogs, for example the Ethiopian wolves, the side strip and black-backed jackals, and some seem to overlap more with dogs such as the lycaon, the grey and golden wolves, or golden jackals. So you may think that some distinction between species are not that clear, but as I told you, with these two axes we only look at the part of the morphological variability existing in the dataset. So two species that overlap on this plan can separate on other dimensions. Canid mummies are represented by question marks in yellow. We see that at least 3 mummies place in the morphological space of wild canids. For the others, they seem rather close to dogs of average morphology, in particular feral dogs, but they may also correspond to grey wolves or golden wolves. These remain to be investigated, and this graph is not enough to assign the species with certainty. To go deeper in species differentiation, I performed some statistical tests. It turns out that dogs can perfectly be identified from other species, but there is some confusion between golden and grey wolves and between golden wolves and black-backed jackal. I think this may be related to my sample because I have only some specimens of around 15 in each species. Moreover, I do not have enough golden jackals for now to test for a difference with golden wolf. The problem with Canisaureus is that most of the time we do not have a provenance, or the provenance is from Africa, so it can't be a golden jackal actually, it's a golden wolf. More modern specimens in this species are thus needed if we want to be more precise in our attribution in ancient canids. To predict the species, I use more specific analyses which are called discriminant analyses. These are very efficient to discriminate domestic and wild canids, so it's very encouraging. Here I use linear discriminant analysis, but in the paper I also use car nearest neighbor analysis, which lead to similar results. And I tried the method of Allowen to work on balanced sample. So if we consider wild versus domestic animals, it's possible, but not if we consider every species, as I have not enough specimens in some species. Among the mummified canids of the Musée des Confluences, our methods identify 33 domestic dogs and 8 wild canids. This may be attributed somewhat unclearly to golden wolf, golden jackal, grey wolf, and Canis mesomelas. So to refine the determination, more modern specimens are needed in each species once again. The linear measurements allow to identify only 90% of the individuals. It's not that bad, but clearly less good than with the 3D analysis. Among the 8 canid mummies identified as wild canids, some have been previously identified as jackals based on the qualitative description, but one was previously assigned to dogs. With the 3D approach, we see that this skull is very close in shape to the grey wolf. It's indeed very close to some modern wolves we find in Syria. As this mummy is from Rhoda in northern Egypt, it's not unlikely that grey wolves may have been present at this site, and as it is very close to the Near East. However, as I explained earlier, grey wolves cannot always be well differentiated from golden wolves, at least for now, with my sample, so I need to improve it with more specimens. This 3D method is thus promising for analyzing series of skull remains from mummified canids. First, it will allow to establish more reliable percentages of wild versus domestic animals in mummies, in an animal catacombs. And second, once the domestic or wild status or even the species is correctly assigned, it will be possible to explore the diversity within the mummified animals that were really dogs. For example, in the case of the mummies I studied at the Museum des Confluences, we observe a certain variability in the mummified dogs, a variability that can be questioned with regard to the conditions in their living environments. Were dogs captured from the wild? Were dogs raised in captivity? Were particular types favored? So this question remains to be investigated, and it will be the purpose of future research dealing with functional morphology and on series of dogs from Egyptian catacombs. So thank you very much. I hope you appreciated the presentation. Bye bye.